So thank you all for joining. We're going to get started here.
All right, so welcome to the April 24th, 2023 meeting. I'll start off by taking roll call. So when I call your name, please take yourself off mute or just acknowledge your presence. So Brenda? Brad?
I'm here.
Chris?
Present.
David?
Present.
Danielle?
Present.
Katie? Marlene? Nicholas?
Present.
Tim? Andrew E? Andrew M? All right, so moving on to the approval of minutes from, we had two meetings, so March 16th. Any questions, comments, or corrections? Right, does anyone have any objections to me approving the minutes from March 16th? Okay, hereby approve the minutes from March 16th, 2023. Did everyone get a chance to look at the March 27th meeting minutes? Any questions, comments, or corrections? All right, anyone have any objection to approving the March 27th, 2023 meeting minutes? Okay, hereby approve the minutes from March 27th, 2023. All right, so looks like we have potentially quite a few comments from the public, so I'd like to open the floor and basically when there's no lectern to step up to, so just feel free to stand or sit in place and state your name and relationship to the city, and try to limit your comments to 5 minutes. Would you like to start us off? Oh, yeah, there we go. So here's the lectern, yeah.
That's okay. We can still hear you. Hello, thanks for the opportunity to speak. And my name is Paul Winterstein. I'm here in my capacity as the Executive Director of the Issaquah History Museums. And this is my 4th week in this position. And I wanted to speak a little about concerning the portion on your agenda later today about the Eck House in Confluence Park. And very fascinating story for me because I actually was on council when we adopted the master plan for Confluence Park. And so it's still unfolding, which is really good to hear. I've had a couple conversations with Director Watling and Jennifer joined us once as well. So well briefed, and I haven't looked at the material ahead of time. The History Museums has not, our board hasn't taken like a formal position on what's going on. We're grateful for the dialogue that we have. We plan, and I'm going to continue to invest to kind of be that partner who helps tell the historic story. And I brought something from our research center I wanted to share with you about that Eck House, which I hope influences some of what you're thinking about portion of this, of the work you're going to do. The Ecks, who actually built this, the immigrants, Christina and Anton Eck. Here's a photo of them from the it was in the 1990 or so Issaquah Press, as the photo of the 5 daughters that grew to adulthood, 5 sons that grew to adulthood. The youngest son here on the right, Walter, had, I don't know anything about his wife, but they had 2 children, and one of whom is still living in Issaquah. So a granddaughter of the people of the immigrants who built this house. And I visited her on last Friday, actually Thursday. And it was a fascinating discussion. And one of the things that we talked about was her memories as a child in the house. She was not able to get around too well and hadn't visited it, didn't realize that there was a nice playground behind it. We talked about that. I told her, updated her a little bit about what was going on to the former house that she remembered, and the memories that she shared with me had to do with a young kid, especially remembering celebrating birthday parties in her grandmother and grandfather's house and playing in the wash house during birthday parties. So, and I think so that's a real part of the history of that house. And this connection, this affinity with the nearby playground, and this idea that any work could result in a space that really encouraged and was welcoming and fun and able to support, who knows, children hosting birthday parties at the playground. And there's a safe facility for them to have that. And it's part of what we do here. Even a little, in my mind, even a little mock-up of the wash house that she remembered playing in. But that's part of our real history from somebody who grew up here, which we didn't even know beforehand that a living member was here in the community. So that was one story I wanted to share with you, which I like very much. And I've learned a little bit recently. I know that the consideration of landmarking it, I know the buildings that we're managing, the exteriors are landmarked. And I've worked with the landmarking commission individual, and I've learned a bit about what we do on the inside of those buildings, like Gilman Town Hall in particular, is really about allowing us to fulfill our mission as an organization. The outside, which is landmarked, that's where the restrictions do apply in terms of what type of maintenance you can do, what type of changes you can do. And now speaking just for myself, this idea that there would be a really well-maintained historical building there that has a clear story told with it. And yet it is now integrated into the community in a way, especially those that enjoy the park. I think that's a really nice outcome. And the last thing I wanted to mention as well is we just talk about like the Eck family. That period of time is a small slice of time in the history of this location, right? We're talking about the first white settlers from Europe that arrived there. I haven't done any research and I can't bring you anything about the First Nation people that lived there for time immemorial beforehand, or even along with that, the natural history before all of that. But this idea that the current shape of this location, which really took on its characters since the Ice Age, since the glaciers retreated, there's a natural history story. There's a Native American history story. There's a European settler story, and there's a more current story. And wouldn't that be wonderful of not only kids enjoying birthday parties, but learning about all of this history as part of the work that you do here. So there's a lot more history in that. There's the hops farm is there. There's some possibilities of negative history stories in that territory. Our goal is to work with the Parks Department to find ways to hopefully add and tell elements of the entire history of that area, not just the most recent white settler history.
Thank you.
Okay, Connie Marsh, live on Squawk. I will, I suppose, segue off of Eck House. I think the money needs to go first to Eck House. We already have a picnic shelter. We already have a playground. The park was not meant to have a lot of playground in it when they established Confluence Park. It's supposed to be a passive park, not hugely active. So I would say that getting the foundations done and getting Eck House into something that can be preserved rather than doing this other work and hoping for funding in the future as Eck House decays further in the park is an unwise decision. So then we're going to go to the pedestrian park and the shelter. And while I like the new sinuous feel of pedestrian park, I looked at the picture and said, wow, that's a lot going on in a park that is so narrow. And so I would, the scale of all of that seems a bit off So I would think about maybe dropping an element in the narrowness of that park. I don't see the history still in the shelter. I'm not sure what those are supposed to be, but they don't evoke anything. Maybe water and really the construct. So not, whatever. So then I'm going to go to the capital prioritization. It's fascinating because I've been through the capital reprioritization maybe 8 times, 6 times. I don't know how many times, and yet the same thing happens. The prioritization chart did not reflect my reality of what community prioritizes. And I was a little confused about legal commitments. I don't know that wayfinding is a legal commitment. I'm pretty sure new park signs are not a community priority in places that we already have them. And so to me, it feels like, yeah, we're doing the same thing as we always did. We're doing what somebody wants to do. And then in one area it says, and we are looking to a new funding source. So here I say, wow, if you look at all of the CIPs, not just the park CIPs, and you calculate the amount of funding that this city wants to spend near term in this next CIP, it is going to blow your flippin' socks off. And then you look at the community and you say, how much are they willing to spend on all of these things and where are they going to want to spend it? And try to look at this list with a jaundiced eye, and there's supposed to be a thing, can it actually happen? But that actually happen thing is really quite green in many places, which I don't think that that is actually true given our current funding source and concepts. So I'm not surprised by the whole thing because this is exactly what has happened the last however many times we did the capital improvement plan, but ever hopeful. So again, fund the house. Don't fund the excess play areas that we already have examples of in that park. Let's actually do something historic, which is what y'all promised the community so many years ago. And at this point in time, it's only gotten destroyed rather than saved. Thanks.
Corey Christensen. I also live on Squawk, and I want to comment both about the Senior Center Depot project and the Heck House. I'll start with the Senior Center project. What bothers me about the project is the Veterans Monument. And given that we're spending, I think it's $4 million now with the latest price increase for the broader project, I think that monument needs to be highlighted. And meaning you're building this plaza in front of the senior center, and historically, all of the land that the senior center on was once part of Memorial Field. And there was actually some controversy years ago when it was the library that people in the public came out and were concerned that they were losing field space. Now, we're not relitigating that or anything. All the point is the ground we're talking about is all Memorial Field and related to that memorial. And so for spending this much money, that memorial needs to be a centerpiece in this plaza. Right now, it's just in a parking strip. And it shouldn't be much to move it where the flagpole and memorial are a centerpiece, because really having people look and think about that memorial is a really important thing, and it's an important thing for many of the city goals, history, but also equity. You know, there's a woman on that monument. There's people that aren't on the monument that could be. One is a fellow missing from the Korean War who was, his mother was an Alaskan Native. And so there's actually a lot of stories that could be told about that the whole thing is that these people are forgotten, and to bring their stories out just by people seeing them, possibly thinking about them, is important. And with all the money that we're spending, it wouldn't be much of a design change to nudge that over 10 feet, 15 feet, and get the approval of the VFW guys and the veterans and community and make this a special place. The Eck House, first I want to thank you guys. There's some progress because previously it was going to be a picnic shelter and totally gone. And so moving forward to where we're at now is a great step forward. However, you really need to take it and push it one step further, maybe more than one step, in that making a firm commitment to do something with it. Because the entirety of the Confluence Park master plan and community meetings that were held, which were very well attended. There were 3 of them, not that long ago, 10, 12 years ago. The historical elements were all a key part of that. And we've already, through a number of reasons, lost some of those historical elements, Anderson House, the barn, things like that. And the promise was that that would be centered in the Eck House. Now, I'm looking at your slides on what could be in the Eck House. There's one thing that alternative that is left out. I mean, you have some beautiful options, but they're very expensive. The one thing that, or building in the city that could be similar, just as an option, is the Trail House that's across from the Parks Department administrative building, which is another similar house in age, outside restored. Inside is just a very simple meeting room. But we've lost that meeting room. It's now the Parks Department is using it for office. And previously what that room was a place that you could go to the community center, and if you were a nonprofit, you could check out a key and use it. And so one of the uses that the Eck House was discussed 10, 12 years ago was having a place where the Girl Scouts can meet or the quilting club can meet. And it wasn't as grand and fancy as what was proposed, but it was still a historic building and a place where people could meet for free, because there really is no place in Issaquah that community groups can meet for free. The other part that is not in there is that some of our other historic buildings were restored by the community, namely Greg Springer and the Dia people. And that's the two that come to mind are the train depot and the Shell Station Hailstone feed store. And they also volunteers have done a lot of work on other historic buildings in Issaquah. And there's an option that, the community could rebuild the Eck House. And an example of that is in Sammamish. There's a similar house called the Reared House that the Sammamish Heritage Society, the community, For Culture, King County Historical Grants, and the Sammamish Parks Department have all collaborated, and that's about to open now. And that is their one landmark building in Sammamish. And that is a model that the Eck House could go under, or could follow. That would be much cheaper than the $1.2 million. Not quite as fancy, but enough to make it so it's not a derelict building. So in conclusion on the Eck House, I think there needs to be a higher level of commitment to do something. If I were sitting at the table, I would want the $800,000 split, where $600,000 of it goes to the playground and the whatever else, the Plaza thing, and $200,000 goes to the Eck House to fix its foundation and do some basic things to get it so it's not a derelict building. Because what's sad is you have this new beautiful structure and plaza next to this derelict building. And it also, from a community perspective, the Parks Department, the city really needs to follow through with their past promises and bring the Eck House forward so people can use it. Anyway, thank you, and I appreciate all your time and efforts.
Any other comments in the room? Okay, I believe, is there one on?
We do have a few people joining us online. If anybody would like to make public comments online, you can feel free to unmute yourself and turn your camera on if you'd like. And we'll give it a couple of minutes. I don't see any activity, so I think we can move on. If you did have comments, feel free, you can write those in either to myself or to the park board.
Okay, so moving forward to the 2024 to 2029 draft CIP for parks and trails.
Great, well, I think that's me then. Let me try to pull up my presentation here. It's open. Great. Okay. All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Andrea Snyder. I'm the Deputy City Administrator. As the Deputy City Administrator, some of my responsibilities include long-term financial planning for the city when it comes to capital assets and infrastructure. And so some of you were at our board summit that we held last February on our CIP, and we talked about criteria. So this is a follow-up to that conversation today. With me, I also have Susie Munsell, who is the city's budget manager, and also she leads the CIP development for us in the city. So thank you, Susie, for being here. And we want to talk about what is in the draft CIP so far when it comes to parks and trails. And that's the focus area that I'm asking for some feedback from you all this evening. I want to start off by saying that the CIP draft is not complete. So you'll notice in your packet, if you're able to take a look at that, there's no actual CIP draft in there. And that's because we are still creating it. In fact, Susie is working on that when she's not here in this room, of putting all those pieces together. So the information that we shared with you in your packet is not even hot off the presses. It's before it even gets to the presses. And that's why there were so many different attachments for you this evening, because we're still compiling it all and putting it all together. And so the draft will be complete and released May 1st, which does not send Susie into a panic spiral. So that's good. I think we're on track. But that's when we'll have the draft whole and complete and ready for more discussion at that point. So tonight, though, we do have focus on parks and trails and what parks and trails projects are within that 6-year plan for the CIP. So that's what we're going to be talking about in relation to the new criteria that we have that we use to vet projects that go into the CIP. And this is when my slides are supposed to advance. Okay, great. So agenda for this evening, we'll talk about the direction and feedback we're looking from you all. Want to give a brief background on the CIP process. As a reminder, we'll talk about an overview of what's in the CIP, some new things for parks and trail, especially near-term projects and planned investments, and then we'll get to the discussion and feedback, and also talk about what is coming next. So we are really looking for feedback on how these criteria were applied. So we're not talking about feedback on individual projects per se. We're really just wondering, the new criteria that we have, how did we do in applying them? Are there any surprises that you felt? Do you think that we missed something in how we applied the criteria, as you were able to hopefully review that before this evening? And my understanding is that you've already talked as a park board about many of these projects, so it shouldn't be, none of these projects should be a huge surprise to you. And again, what we're really looking for feedback on is about the criteria. If we were to use them again, what changes should we consider? Did we miss anything big in how we applied them? So first, before we get into that discussion, just a reminder, the CIP, the Capital Improvement Plan, is a planning document. It's not a budget. So all of this is just what's in the plans, how are we lining this up for the budget to be put into action later. So things on this list for the next 6 years and what is on the list for the out years is subject to change, but this is kind of our best guess so far. A reminder, you should probably recognize this lovely image that Hassanthi helped create for us from the board summit. And what this talks about are the steps through that we're taking to get to a capital project, right? So we have the 20-year master plan, or in this case, the park strategic plan, which I know we are updating again this year. We look at that far out picture. That is where the park board and others in the community are able to influence what projects, what policies are we considering for that big long-term vision. Then we use that strategic plan to formulate what's in the 6-year CIP. We use the criteria to prioritize what goes into that 6-year CIP. So that middle trapezoid is where we are today. And then we use that 6-year CIP to help formulate our 2-year budget and to really figure out, okay, out of that 6-year CIP, now we have better revenue estimates. Now we really know how much things are going to cost. What can we actually get done in the next 2 years? And then we go into the funded capital project. And sometimes I think the Parks Board has some more feedback into exactly what that project looks like on that level as well. So that's the general process for how projects can become real, from vision to implementation. And we are in that middle box. Okay, background. So changes since the last CIP. We do a big CIP update every 2 years. And changes since last time, we had a capital finance community task force. Brad Books sat on that task force to represent the park board. That concluded in 2021. And the task force had a couple of recommendations. They recommended the city do more to invest in infrastructure, including the pursuit of new revenue tools to help us do more. The task force also recommended and stated that mobility and transportation was a first priority for the city, but that parks and trails and facilities were also really important. And also, since the last CIP, we've adopted new criteria, and we have tried to improve the criteria that we've carried over from past years. We've also added this red, yellow, green grading. Before it was check the box, yes or no, do you meet this criteria? So we've tried to raise the bar on which projects really meet it, how well are they meeting it, and have us think about these things. So we've tried to incorporate both of these recommendations from the task force, as well as the new criteria, into how we drafted the CIP, trying to take all of those things together with figuring out which projects we can do in the next 6 years. So here are the new criteria that we talked about at the board summit. There was a follow-up memo that I think Director Watling went over with a subsequent meeting that spoke to these criteria, how they were changed from the board summit. So I'm not going to get into those details with you tonight. That information is available in your packet. So you can see more information on what the criteria are, what they mean, what is part of the red, yellow, green thresholds and grading, and how we determined that. What I want to say is how we've used these new criteria. So when we ask staff to submit projects for consideration into the CIP, we ask the staff to go through their criteria and self-rate. So did they think that this project was a red, yellow, and green? And so Jen Fink, our wonderful Jen Fink, had to do a lot of that for the Parks and Trails project. So if you have questions about why something's graded one way or another, hopefully Jen can help enlighten us on those questions. Once staff self-graded, finance was kind of an independent party overseeing that too. So they reviewed those gradings, tried to check for consistency across the organization, that kind of thing. Looked at scores, worked with departments more. But you know, this is our first year applying these types of criteria in this way. And I know that one of the pieces of feedback from this board was, you know, red, yellow, and green, it's not very nuanced. We want to have more nuance to that conversation. And maybe there should be some weighting associated with this. And so, you know, I think what we took a look at is we chose the time not to weight each of these individual criteria, but there were times where if you look through some of the attachments in your packet, you'll see that sometimes things rated kind of low in one category, but maybe legal mandate or life and safety concerns really outweighed some of the criteria. That's especially true in things like utility infrastructure, for example, or infrastructure related to public safety. And so sometimes those weighted a lot more in that project. And there was a bit of an art in how we applied some of these criteria. We also heard feedback from this board about accessibility and ability for those who may be colorblind to see red, yellow, and green and some of the public information. That's something we've received. I think as Susie prepares the draft, we're going to have colors, but we'll also have patterns associated with the colors. So even if somebody can't distinguish red, yellow, and green, they'll be able to see, okay, this pattern means essentially green. This pattern means essentially yellow. So that should help. That and plus the metadata should help improve the accessibility and readability of the color scheme, even for those that may be colorblind. Okay. Any questions so far?
Question about the longstanding commitment.
Yes.
Which is a new
Thank you. Yeah.
element, and if you could,
Trying to go back. There we go.
yeah. So that to me, I was thinking when I read through this that it would apply to perhaps like finished projects that aren't quite finished, or like when we have like a particular phase at in a master plan that like hasn't been done. So like the Egg House would be a perfect example of this, right? Like it's in a phase of the park that has pretty much been complete. The only part of that master plan and that phasing that hasn't been complete is the Egg House. We have another phase of Confluence Park that we haven't, that requires removal of the shop and everything in order to activate. But so in my mind, it would be nice to have some sort of priority like that also reflected, so that we are actually completing the projects that we start and, not ending up with, something that has languished and, deteriorated in the meantime.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment, and I'd love to pass that on to City Council. So let's talk a little bit about this, a longstanding commitment. This is something, as we met with the boards and talked about criteria, we also met with the City Council. And they really wanted to put something in the criteria speaking to this longstanding commitment. We asked them to try to define it a little further. They had some difficulty in the moment doing it, and what we settled on was that they wanted us to come back with a list of prior commitments that the city had made, and then they would kind of discuss that list and choose amongst that list. And that conversation is slated to happen in May at some point. So they haven't defined it further. It's pretty nebulous. We weren't really able to apply it during kind of that staff process. That is something that City Council is going to weigh in on later, but I would love to pass on your comments then, because I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's different in every different part of the city, but for us, it would be nice to, there's certain things that just keep getting pushed and pushed and pushed, and it's like, well, at some point we need to do it.
Yeah, great, thank you. Just making note of that. Okay. Great. General overview for the CIP overall, not just parks and trails projects. But in general, one of the themes that we have is that there's a lot more funding and attention and focus on maintenance programs than we've had in the past. So we've been trying to make sure that we're actually maintaining our infrastructure. I think one of the things that Director Watling may have said to you in the past is that our development in Issaquah, a lot of our infrastructure, not just parks, a lot in streets and utilities, was built privately by private development, and they developed it. But now it's been over 10 years since the Issaquah Highlands was developed. It's been over 10 years since Dallas was developed, and we're getting to a place where we need to, we don't have all this new infrastructure anymore. We need to maintain stuff that was built. Much of it was built by the private development community originally. Of course, we also have our own assets that we've built a while ago and need to maintain. So, and we're trying to plan more and more for maintenance and make sure we're doing a better job of that. So you'll see more funding, more focus for maintenance programs in the past. And that was one of the criteria that we had. So you'll see a lot to address that. The CIP also responds to feedback from the city council, from the task force, that we should be making more investments in our infrastructure overall. We need to maintain, yes, but also build new. This is a growing community. And so they also wanted to make sure that the plan was achievable. In years past, we've bitten off a lot more than we can chew in our efforts to be ambitious and be responsive to feedback we've heard from the community. And this year we tried to take extra care to say, okay, what do we have the financial resources to do? What also do we have the people resources to do? Where maybe are there issues with supply chain? Because the global supply chain is still complicated to navigate these days. And how is that impacting our projects and what we're able to get done? So we tried to take a look at all of those components while also, again, wanting to respond to feedback that we need to make more investments. And as a result, this CIP anticipates new revenues. And so I think we heard public comments this evening speaking to that. That's absolutely right. We have heard from the task force, from council, that this community wants to talk about new revenues to fund infrastructure. So this CIP anticipates that conversation. For transportation, as the task force recommended, that was the first priority. And so within this CIP, we will be asking council to consider a 1% sales tax for transportation related projects. I'm sorry, thank you, 0.1%, much smaller than 1%. Thank you, Susie. I appreciate that correction. 0.1%, there's a very big difference. And that's something that we're going to be talking to council about a lot more moving forward. We also need to take a look at how to fund our public safety facilities, municipal court. The police station is busting at the seams. We have a fire station we need to build. There's some significant public safety facility needs that we need to figure out how to fund. We'll be talking more with council about that as we move forward. And parks and trails. So if you took a look at that list and when those lists of projects were planned in the next 6 years, you may have seen that, it relates to the next slide, you may have seen that a lot of those parks and trails projects were listed for 2027, 2028, 2029, later years in the CIP. And this is because we are anticipating potentially a public vote for new revenue to help pay for parks and trails projects. So we haven't planned out exactly what that vote could look like, what exactly is in that package. That's several years from now. But that is something that we are anticipating, is trying to find a new revenue so that we can do more for parks and trails. And I think you've probably heard follow-ups from the task force discussion. There was some discussion, recommendation from the Community Capital Finance Task Force on Metropolitan Parks District. That will be something we'll be discussing more, but I wanted to make sure to highlight that for you tonight, that this is anticipated in the CIP, that we want to move that forward and have those discussions in the next 6 years, and really looking at that 2027, 2028 years to contemplate that. So that's pretty exciting and ambitious for us, but we've heard from the community that they want more investments in public infrastructure, and so we're trying to figure out how to respond to that and how to pay for it. So CIP overview for Parks and Trails specifically, it follows the same theme as the overall CIP. So we have more emphasis on maintenance and replacement programs within the Parks and Trails CIP. We're going to talk about those in just a second, but so you'll see more of that in Parks and Trails. Other than that, we have 20 Parks and Trails programs or projects recommended in the 6-year plan overall. And almost all park and trail projects scored high in the following criteria: community priority, community livability and quality of life, and replacement or maintenance. And so we had some really well-scoring park and trail projects. And we already talked about how many projects are planned for 2027 plus. So I wanted to highlight for you some of the investments that we have slated for the near term, 2024 to 2026. when we look at the CIP, it's a 6-year plan. And we also have projects planned for future out years beyond those 6 years, because we want to be looking out as well. But when it comes to predicting the future, the farther out you go, the harder it is to predict the future. And so we really try to make sure that 2024, 2025, 2026 are pretty balanced, that we have revenues assigned to pay for those, that we have those pretty well planned out. So I am looking at those near-term years within the 6-year plan. Just wanted to highlight for you what is in store and what's in the plan for the next couple of years. And so this slide is talking about all of those programs that are more ongoing. So most of these are replacement or maintenance programs, as you can see from the name. So park and open space acquisition program, that's an ongoing program. Playground equipment replacement, park amenities life cycle replacement, the creek corridor, irrigation replacement, and trail repair programs. So a lot of these are associated either with long-term ongoing efforts such as acquisition or maintenance and replacement. And there are more of those replacement programs in this CIP for parks than were in the past. Then we have projects. And so again, these are the near-term projects that 2024 to 2026. So projects would be, many of them funded by ARPA that you're familiar with. We've been talking a lot about these lately. Confluence Park, Veterans Memorial, Field Depot and Pedestrian Park, the Hillside Loop Trail, East Sunset Trailhead, the Wayfinding program implementation, and Rainier Trail. So these are the projects within that very near term. And just for the sake of time, I didn't want to list all 20 projects in the CIP. It is in your packet, so you can take a look at the rest if you haven't already. So here's where we are. We met earlier in this year to refine those criteria. We're here now in that space on the timeline that's emboldened in black. We're looking for board feedback and how you feel the CIP, the draft CIP, meets the criteria. Then we take that feedback and provide it to the council committees. They'll be meeting later on in May to review sections of the CIP. So the parks, the Safety Services and Parks Committee will be meeting in May. And so I'd love to take your feedback from you here today and present that feedback to them in that meeting. And the council will have a couple of meetings to discuss what's in the CIP. First, those council committees are gonna focus on their specific infrastructure. Like I said, Safety Services and Parks, we'll take a look at parks and safety related infrastructure. Then we have, mobility and infrastructure, for example, we'll take a look at transportation, infrastructure, et cetera. So I'd love to take your feedback, provide it to the city council committees who will deliberate more and discuss more. Then we have COW, which stands for Committee of the Whole, to discuss the entire CIP together and try to balance out the different infrastructure categories like parks, transportation, facilities, et cetera. And then we look to council adoption by July 1st. So that's the next steps and where we are. Are there any questions before we get to the discussion section?
Yeah, real quick. So the process of evaluating all the items has already been completed. Now it's recommendation time.
Yes, so the process for evaluating items was completed by the administration internally as we tried to create the CIP. And so we're looking for feedback from you on, did we do a good job? Did we miss something glaring? How did that go?
Then I do have a question that kind of relates back to previous. One of the items that was discussed during that multi-board meeting was when people were looking at the red, yellow, green approach, and based on experience, and then also maybe newer perspectives that need to be applied or ought to be applied, there was the recommendation of maybe doing like a -2 to a +2 so that you could, a project that could go forward, that red might seems like a 0 right now, but something that like a transportation project is important, but it has potentially a negative environmental impact, and that needs to be considered. Alternatively, many park projects may not have a transportation value or something like that, And so there was a desire for some of that. So I guess I'm wondering if you could provide a little insight in how you applied the red, yellow, green to projects that may have an actual negative impact on a different criterion.
Yeah, so I think we looked at the balance of the criteria as a whole to start. So if you look in your packet, there's an attachment that talks about the projects that are within the 6-year CIP, and it shows how each of them rank with the criteria of red, yellow, green. So you'll see a red, yellow, and green value for each of those criteria and projects. And so you can see where the projects stand in terms of how many have red, how many have green, et cetera. So we looked at that to place them within that 6-year time frame. And they were assigned at the time some numerical values of 1, 2, and 3. And then we were able to use that as a starting place, knowing that that was really the start of the conversation, right? So if something scored a certain number, we wanted to take a look at that and say, okay, what does that mean though, given how much we know of, staff time, can we really get this done? What does that mean in relation to some of the task force recommendations? What does that mean in relation to if this is a life safety issue, how urgent of a life safety issue is it? It could be a life safety issue in 2026, but maybe not in 2025, right? So we kind of need to weigh all these things, and that's where sometimes the math doesn't really help us. So we use it as a starting place, but not as an ending place. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I think maybe it's something to consider the next time around, if not this time.
Okay, fair. And I feel like Hasanti's gonna give me the hook because I think I'm going over. But I don't want to shortchange any questions or discussion.
I have a question, Henry.
Yes.
So looking at the plan today and the list of projects, it seems like we're scoring the lowest on climate resiliency or environmental benefit. So for a city that is rooted in its identity and nature with also adopting that climate action plan in 2021, with a plan that encompasses multiple years, does the administration feel like it's not sending a strong message on its climate initiatives with how it reflects in the list of projects that they presented here?
That's a wonderful question. And I think having the criteria, I think it helps us look at these projects from that lens and see, that is surprising to me when I saw the results of that. And maybe Jen, you want to talk a little bit more about how you looked at the criteria to score some of these projects with the environment.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about, completely answer your question to that bigger picture.
And looking at the, which projects really in that climate resiliency and environmental benefit that scored negatively, those 2 projects were wayfinding and signage implementation, as well as the Hillside Loop Park Trail. Wayfinding, it's mostly facility signage, directional signage. There really isn't an impact other than in the manufacturing of it. So not always is a red deemed a negative. It just may not apply. And so therefore it is a negative. Hillside Loop Trail. There's already social trails within Hillside Park, and formalizing some of those or expanding them really isn't doing a detriment to the environment, nor is it enhancing it in all the same. So there really wasn't like a net zero on that, which is why it's scored as a negative, because there wasn't any new benefit out of it. So it's not necessarily a bad thing for something to have a negative. It just may not apply, or it may just be a nuance of that individual project, like, furthering existing social trails, widening a trail. You may actually end up adding some understory plantings, but as an overall, when you look at kind of the big picture of that project, environmental impact isn't a real large factor.
And I would add on to that, because this community really values protecting the environment and enhancing the environment where we can, we have that criteria threshold to get a green is very high. It means that the project prevents or corrects detrimental impact to vital habitat, ecosystems, natural resources, or it prevents or corrects contributions to climate change. So that's a really high bar. Whereas in comparison, the red and when a project will score red, it means it has no environmental impact, not that it has a detrimental impact.
Right.
So if something scores red, it's not because it's hurting the environment, it's just neutral. So that's a really high bar. And so given how high of a bar we've set, I think that it's not very concerning that many of the park projects scored a yellow, because to score a yellow is pretty good, I think, in that it reduces a detrimental impact or provides a benefit to vital habitat, ecosystem, and natural resource. It has some positive effects. So it has some environmental benefit when it scores a yellow, and that was most of the park projects. And I think that's a pretty good story to tell. We do have projects that are in the city that are meeting an even higher bar in preventing or correcting detrimental impact. It's just, so yellow's a pretty good score, I think. Yeah. Great. Any other questions, or we can move on to the feedback portion, discussion portion for tonight? I also don't want to ignore our friends who are joining us virtually, making sure there's no hands that I haven't seen. Okay.
I had as far as if there are surprises for what's in the 6-year plan, and maybe this is not quite on this topic, but, the improvements to Harvey Manning Park, I wasn't sure what that was.
That's in a current, yeah, that's in a current, CIP, the 23. So the funding's in this year, so it's not shown in the 24. So it's still an active project. It's just not in this 24 to 29 period.
Okay. And what are those improvements? Is that like just connecting trails?
Connecting trails, yeah. Through the park over to Big Ridge Tree Trail and then up to Harvey Manning Park as well. Creating new trails and crossing some of the waterways in there.
When that is completed, is it going to bring regional traffic to at that park for hiking purposes?
Yes, and also up to Harvey Manning Park as well as the.
No, like,
Cougar Well.
that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Like, are people gonna drive to Harvey Manning Park as a trailhead?
No, we're actually promoting Tibbetts Valley Park, a
Okay.
park and ride as main access through there. Part of the delay in getting that is, in order to provide trail connections, we need to be able to provide safe pedestrian access along Newport. And so we've had some challenges in further exploring what our options are to do that work.
Okay, that was my concern.
Yes.
Great. So any feedback on how we applied the criteria? Any changes we should consider? I heard Chris Kovac, you mentioned again, maybe we should consider changing how we graded them in terms of using a more numerical system, something that's a bit more nuanced.
Yeah, I think, just to add to it, based on experience going through some of these red, yellow, green analyses, and there's some things that are, well, it's a zero, kind of like the sign program. It's really does have, it's inconsequential environmentally, but something else like parking lot would have a negative impact and might need some other, mitigation to offset that or something. And so that's, I think, where that idea was coming from, to allow for that kind of consideration.
I think one other question I have or feedback is, these criteria, I'm not sure how well they allow you to sort of prioritize a project that's necessary to have another project done, or, like in order to sort of phase projects. And so as an example of that, there are, we keep talking about doing a master plan for Tibbetts Valley Park, and as well as doing something at Veterans Memorial Field. Those parks have 6 baseball fields on them. And we know that likely, based on the master planning stuff we started a couple of years ago before COVID, the number of baseball fields that would probably happen at Tibbetts will be shrunk. And the answer to that is probably, fixing the Little League fields at Central Park, which are not the proper size, nor do they drain. So anyway, in order to sort of do that strategically, one would, if you were planning yourself, you would say, okay, well, I'm gonna fix those Central Park ones first, so that, as we deal with the other parks, we can do that first. So anyway, that's just an example of something that I don't know how well this existing criteria captures that, and it might be something else that should, you might want to try to bump something.
If you'll remember, excuse me if I jump in here,
Yeah.
in the park strategic plan, we did do kind of a project prioritization within that. There was a checklist, and then there was kind of once you get into that project, an additional checklist. So I think that might address some of that preliminary, like, which should come first, chicken or the egg kind of thing on some of these projects.
But is that part of
But
this
what
analysis?
that did though, is because these are near-term to early midterm
Mhm.
projects, because we checked off a lot of our early term projects. So we're starting to get into the last of those and into our midterms now. Well, as we go into our new park strategic plan update, should in that engagement, new projects arise, we run through that criteria again and recategorize the priorities of all of the different projects within there. And so we may have new early term projects, new midterm projects, and new long-term projects. And then that will feed the next update of the park CIP. So we're kind of in mid-process right now, functioning from the existing park strategic plan.
Mhm.
But as we get ready to roll into the next one, we may see some jostling in 2 years when we update this again. Some of those projects getting reprioritized as to what's a near-term project versus a midterm project.
Yeah, I guess my point being, I don't think that of these criteria, when we're like grading things red, yellow, or green, that we capture that prioritization that might need to happen, that we all kind of know that needs to happen.
Yeah.
But if we're trying to actually,
I think
have
that
it
would actually
documented.
be applied a little bit. I think we can do some work in the clarity of the prioritization within the park strategic plan, because then when it goes from, let's say there's 5 near-term projects, which one is first out of the gate may be due to funding availability or timing of projects or other work that's getting done in the neighborhood, or, a lot of other different factors could play into that permitting process. So there may be some ways in the park strategic plan we could further filter and prioritize some of those projects, because by the time it comes to this, it's more of a funding what we can realistically do within each year, because where there are finite dollars within each of these years that we try and juggle what can get done. And so sometimes, though it's a near term, if there just isn't a budget, it might get pushed out a year.
But I think it's a really good point, and I want to make sure to capture this feedback, because I think it's something that we can be thoughtful and consider during the strategic planning process, but also incorporate in the criteria for the CIP as well, to think about it as more systems planning and how things relate to each other. And that isn't explicitly captured in our criteria. You're absolutely correct. So
yeah, when you look at it, it's just like, all of these things are kind of like near-term projects. It's like, well, one of them might be more important than another for reasons that aren't necessarily captured here. So, anyway, thank you.
It's a good point, because something that maybe doesn't score as well in I don't know, community priority, but it supports it's necessary, or it should be necessary for it to happen, that maybe scores better. We need to consider all of that together. So I think I'd love to pass that feedback on to council.
Thanks.
Thank you. Great. Any other feedback? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate this. So what I would like to do with your feedback, I've taken copious amounts of notes. If it's okay with you, I'd just like to incorporate that into my memo to City Council that will include the feedback we've gathered from all of the boards about the CIP So that's one option, is that I can incorporate that into my materials for council. If you, as a board, felt more strongly you wanted to convey the message yourself, then another option would be for you to draft a letter with this feedback, and you can send it to council directly if that's your preference. So I look to the board for guidance on how you want your feedback to be communicated to city council.
Okay, just, I guess, a quick show of hands. Is there interest in, perhaps drafting a letter as a board, to be sent to council?
Would it be, I mean, we haven't really actually, didn't we say the draft CIP is actually coming out in May 1st? So to me, it feels premature to be giving formal feedback at this point in the form of a memo that we would prepare.
Okay.
I would think you'd want to do that after it actually comes out. But
I think with respect to, reflecting on the criteria and how they were applied, I think as long as you're taking the notes and we'll deliver it back, that would be adequate for me.
Okay.
Okay.
Is everyone okay with, sending Andrea, submit the feedback that she received at the meeting today, by a show of hands, if that's okay?
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time today and allowing us to present. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so, moving forward to the community investment strategy project update for, Confluence Park Tech House.
Hello, everyone. I want to first invite our Within team to turn their cameras on. Today we have with us Christian and Amelia and Charlie from, probably recognize these faces. They've been here a time or two, to help us with our presentation on the park board. So give me just 1 minute here for the house while I do a quick screen share.
And Jennifer, I still couldn't get my webcam to work, so
Oh,
apologies to everybody.
that's quite all right. All right. Can everyone see this presentation? Okay, great. So thank you. We are here to provide you an update on the community investment strategy Confluence Park Eck House project. Wow, and taking a step back, some of our goals for this project were to restore the Eck House and to better connect it to Confluence Park as a public amenity. And we also want to, as Paul Winterstein mentioned in his public comment, we want to recognize and celebrate the history of the Eck House. And thank you for bringing forward some wonderful facts. We look forward to including those. And also include some possible landmarking of the Eck House. So with this, I'm going to pass it over to Charlie Abel. He is the architect on the project, to kind of walk through what some of our scoping and our project phasing was for this project, as well as some of the discovery.
Thank you so much. And yeah, quick disclaimer right off the bat, this is really focused on scope and phasing. It's not a design presentation. We're not putting, true design proposals together. I think there are like two key themes here, casting a wide net and also trying to think big. We recognize it's easier to kind of roll things back and scale things down, but we wanted to kind of start with a big vision up front and see what felt right. So jumping right in, one of the first things that we did is really kind of created a big, long wish list of what are all the different things that could go into the various elements of this project. So we broke it up into the Eck House, the Wash House, shelter and plaza, potential future play area, and really tried to go through the nitty gritty of what might be involved. So everything from utility upgrades to painting the exterior. We even tried to categorize things as minor options or major options. So for example, on an interior renovation, you could simply clean up the interior, or you could go all the way to demolishing all the interior walls and leaving just the shell of the building to kind of create a big dramatic double height volume. So again, trying to think big and casting a wide net. Next slide. So at the same time, we were also trying to think through some of the paths to getting to any one of those specific items. And specifically, there are a couple big triggers right away. So landmarking versus not landmarking, the process looks quite different depending on which of those two strategies you take. Some of the options might look similar, but the path is very different. So for example, in landmarking, you could preserve the house and create this new public amenity, and landmarking not only helps preserve the history of the space in a really kind of official way, but it also potentially unlocks additional funding. Alternatively, no landmarking could really provide a lot of flexibility. You could demolish the house and either create a replica using modern construction techniques, or create something entirely fresh and new. But you potentially lose those additional funding opportunities, and you potentially lose some of that history if you go the demolition route. So again, casting a wide net, trying to understand all these variations as we move forward. Next slide. And so part of the reason for that wide net is that the Eck House does have some issues. As you can see in the upper left, the foundations are literally tree stumps sitting on old concrete pads. It's stable as is. That's not to say this is somehow dangerous, but if you do go the route of trying to turn this into a public amenity to be occupied by groups of people, the foundations need to be upgraded. This is not safe for assembly type usages. As people have noted, there was also a fire at some point, and so one of the porches was destroyed, as well as the fire spreading and destroying some of the interior flooring. And at some point in the house's history, one of the exterior porches was enclosed, and the preservation representatives made it clear that returning this to its original kind of exterior porch configuration is something that they're very interested in. So all these kind of little different components have been factored into any of the options. Next slide. So our A&E team did an assessment of the different elements. So specifically at a high level, if again, you change the use in order to make a public amenity, you need to change the use from residential to an assembly space. The foundations would therefore need to be upgraded, and the structure needs to be stabilized. The seismic system would likely need to be upgraded. There are some very nuanced triggers here, depending on how far we go with any of these options, but generally speaking, there are likely seismic upgrades. We have been exploring the possibility of fully opening up that interior space to maximize its flexibility and maximize the amount of area for the interior, essentially creating a large double height shell, and then retaining the historic elements that do still exist with the renovation. Next slide. Similarly, the King County Historic Preservation Group provided us with their feedback. So tying that in together, they made it clear that the exterior shell to them is what has the historic value. The interior has gone through a lot of renovations over time, and most of that historic character has been lost. So that's actually kind of good news for allowing Issaquah to sort of do whatever they want functionally with the interior of the space. Similarly, the porches in the front entry have a lot of historic value. The windows, while they've been replaced with vinyl, could be replaced again with wood, and there might be additional funding available for that type of change. The back of the house, i.e. the west side that faces the park, is not a historic priority. And so this would be the opportunity to make connections to the park, open it up, potentially situate a new pavilion adjacent to it, because this is a as you've seen, a pretty blank facade, not a lot of historic character. The improvements to that backspace would need to maintain a minor separation. They really like to make it clear to the public what is new and what is original and historic. And then they are open to engaging in a design process and possible landmarking after the restoration. So there's potentially some play in terms of how we sequence things. So just kind of overall picture starting on the right, that's the Eck House proper, and we're sort of seeing that as one piece of scope. In the middle is the Shelter Plaza scope. So again, these aren't design presentations necessarily, just trying to capture the scope. So the shelter, potentially the wash house and the plaza area. And then at some point, maybe in the future, play area, but you can see that's dashed in. So that is not really a part of this discussion for this scoping. So as people have talked about, we're also throwing out some basic ideas here for what this could be. Going back to my disclaimer, big, wide net here and trying to think big. And these are not design proposals. These are merely meant to say, okay, if we did something, how many people could you fit in here and what might this look like? All of these studies assume that kind of big vision of, well, what if we demolish the second floor? What if we remove all the interior walls, essentially just have a big double height shell that allows us for the most flexibility over time? And these studies also don't include any of the other proposals you just saw of the outdoor pavilion. They don't address code. They don't address accessibility. That all comes later. These are really just to give you a sense of scale and possibilities. So next slide. So we kind of have three main options lined up. One could be an art or exhibition gallery focused on local artists and the community. Excuse me. And you can see how in plan that might work, where you could have vitrines and seating clustered in the center with artwork around the perimeter. And it actually works quite well in terms of the distances that you'd want to have for optimal art viewing and connections to some of those exterior porches for kind of an indoor-outdoor feel. Next slide. You could also consider this for dining or receptions. So think a retirement party or a football fundraiser, things of that nature, or even a wedding reception, for example. And so this might lay out where you'd have, we're not proposing a kitchen here. This would just be exterior food brought in from the exterior, catered food, laid out on a buffet to the left with all of your seating to the right. And this totals roughly 40 to 50 seats. And you'll find in the other option too, that's kind of the sweet spot in terms of the sort of capacity of this space. Next slide. And then the last one we're proposing here is speaker, music, or ceremony venue. So this could be a local violin player. This could be a poetry reading. This could be an actual wedding ceremony. Next slide. And so this is showing more of that lecture type format where you'd have the speaker over on the right, you'd have presentation screens, all the seating focus there. Again, this is right around 50 people, so that number seems to keep popping up in terms of capacity. You could have a bar to the left, a check-in desk, and again, we could open up that left side facing the park to create a connection to the play area, to the plaza, to a potential outdoor pavilion to create a flow between inside space, outside space. And those are the three options.
Great, thank you, Charlie. So I know Jeff went and spoke with the Issaquah History Museum last week, and as we've been working with the ad hoc group as well and others, we have a recommended approach of doing this in 2 phases. Phase 1, as Charlie referenced, would first be for us to focus on the plazas and the outdoor spaces. This we could complete with the existing ARPA funds within the current budget and within the required timelines of the ARPA funding. I think that's something we really need to keep in mind, is that the funding needs to be used by the end of 24. In phase 2 for Eck House restoration, because of the historic nature of the building, if we continue down the landmarking path, ensuring we can honor the history of the building, it is going to take a little more time to develop the plans, to do the landmarking, and to get everything in line in order to not only fund, but also construct that building. So we're recommending that be a phase 2 for future, but we could also use that time to seek some grant opportunities if we were to proceed with landmarking, find some other grants to help us with some of the systems, as Charlie mentioned, retaining the porches, ensuring time period windows that are wood cladded and not vinyl are installed, and really making sure we can spend the time on the details to help honor the history. And then once we complete the restoration, we'd be working with the King County Preservation during the design process. And then once the restoration was complete, we'd go through the formal landmarking process. So what that would look like is we'd really concentrate on this outside area here as phase 1, and then the restoration as phase 2. Just some preliminary costs. Just a reminder, we have 800,000 allocated for this project. Some early Eck House restoration costs are around $1 million to 1.2, depending upon a few unknowns at this time and when the work would get done. But we do have some this is a wonderful project to seek some grant opportunities and funding sources for. So I think what we would actually pay would be much less than that, because I think we'd be able to do some fundraising and be a great candidate for grants. So with that, we'd love to hear any discussion and feedback from the board. And ad hoc, if you want to add anything too, please feel free to chime in at this time.
Yeah.
I definitely support this proposal, especially in lieu of the concept of tearing it down and doing a picnic shelter. This is much more in line with what the master plan had and that we talked about when we adopted the master plan. Back then, we really talked about having the house being available for community use. So for classes or for like rental space, meeting space. And this seems to sort of to hit that. I would hope that you'd have, and I also really like Paul's suggestion of looking at the trail house as, so we used to have our park board meetings in the trail house, and if people haven't been there, it's a great place to look and see how, how that you could just open up a space and have it be a little bit more modern inside. I really hope that we'd have a bathroom in there. I don't know if that was.
Yeah, we kind of talked about the wash house, even with the historic center, that if we could make that an outdoor restroom, that would serve the building.
Okay.
It would be outside, but thinking that the wash house could be converted.
Could be
to
that, yeah.
use. Yeah.
It just seems like you would need something
And
like that. Yeah.
especially for the playground or that,
Yeah.
but yeah. Great point.
So I'm much happier about this than the original kind of proposals that came out a few months ago.
Great.
Brad?
Thanks. Actually, I kind of support what Danielle just had to say, but I'll just kind of add on to that. One thing, it's a little hard for me to understand how it's going to take $1 million to restore this house. All of us that have homes that we insure for total losses, look in the neighborhood of $250, $300 a square foot. That house isn't probably any larger than 1,000 square feet, which makes it like $1,000 a square foot for restoration. So it's hard for me to understand the numbers for that. But that being said, I know there's a lot more that has to go into it because of it being, commercial property to some extent. I do have some issues with the playground concept as something that Connie pointed out, and I actually had an opportunity to take a light review of the master plan. it does show that Confluence Park is designed for passive recreation, and it's questionable whether or not an increased playground would be considered a passive playground or passive recreation. I would think that's to be more active recreation. So I think we need to be very careful about what's done in that regard. I guess my last point is, we talk a lot about history, and when I look through the master plan, there's an awful lot of historical information in there. And yet I find that we have a huge missed opportunity for presenting historical information to the community. When I look at the Anderson farmhouse and what was done there, I like what was done there, but for a person to go there would have no clue regarding the history of that area. And so, I would really like to see us add into some of these proposals some historical interpretive elements to both Anderson and Eck, so that history can be preserved and communicated to the community. And right now, none of that is done. And I don't really see any of that in any of these proposals that is an element to consider. So that's just one more thing that I'd like to put out there. But overall, I do like the preservation on this new phase issue. I'm a little off on the cost, but I do think the phase 1, phase 2 makes some sense. I do have some concerns, like Corey said, to have a $800,000 area, next to a house that is dilapidated, and who knows when we're ever going to have the funding to fix that. So to me, it would be nice if we could actually restore the house as a part of the ARPA money. But I realize that that's challenging in terms of timing. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Brad, I just want to quickly address your concerns regarding interpretive elements and historic. When we met with King County Historic Preservation, that was one of the big topics we had with them, and I'm sorry if that wasn't translated today, because we're really talking about different uses of space and different projects, but that how we include history as part of the landmarking process and the restoration process was huge. They really want us to emphasize the farming history of this space, and also the important features of the building, as well as other history with it. So definitely, as we get into further designing the Eck house and further designing the patio space, digging into that history is definitely going to be part of the storytelling of this entire space and restoration.
Thanks for that clarity, Jen. Maybe we can take some of that further for the Anderson farmhouse as well.
Definitely.
I want to respond to the Brad, to the comment about the passive use versus active at the park. And my recollection is that the majority of that space that it has been developed at Confluence was acquired with monies that required it to be passive, because it was creekside purchases and whatnot. But that corner of the park, and the way that we acquired the Eck house and that property was with different money. And so that actually did not have the same sort of restrictions, and could be active. And then I want to remind everyone that the most exciting phase from my perspective is like still, who knows how far in the future, but it's actually the active part of the park, which was in the master plan, is where the city's like shops and stuff is, and will require that to be relocated. But that land then can all be active use, and like the drawings and stuff for the master park that we did were really exciting for that part of the property. So there is supposed to be an active component of that park, but just not the part that we've developed yet.
Thanks for sharing that, Danielle. I know you're the only one that you were the only one around back in the days when that master plan was created. So I know you have some insight.
Yes, and thank you for bringing up that piece. That corner, you're correct, is the one piece of the park that is allowed to be developed more so than other spaces within the park. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a funding issue, like the
Yeah.
way that we either, got matching grants or purchase a property or
Correct.
had it given to us, or, whatever, all the rest of the pieces.
Yeah.
Along there had restrictions.
Yep. So this one does allow for the additional uses that are being proposed.
Any other comments, questions?
Okay, great. Just as a follow-up, I'll be updating the Issaquah History Museum board in full this Thursday as well, and we'll take our discussion forward with them as well. So, right, any more on this topic? Brad, your hand's still up. Did you have another comment?
How's that?
Okay. All right, then, bear with me really quick, and I will, this is difficult sharing when you are on your own computer, so bear with me. All right, now we're moving on to the next ARPA project, which is Community Investment Strategy. Oops. For the pedestrian park and senior center plazas. And again, we've got our wonderful Methuen team joining us here as backup. Just kind of, it's been a little bit since we've talked about this project, and just wanted to do a quick recap from our meeting in February. As you may recall, we spent a lot of time with the ad hoc, and we had gone over a summary of 4 different framework options that then were reduced into 2 concepts for consideration. Was the Creekside Table as well as Valley Trail. We took that design out, brought it to you prior to doing our public engagement. And this was the Valley Trail concept, you can see here. And then the Creekside Table, which should look familiar. Since that time, we did our public survey and open house in March. We received over 500 comments back. Those comments were included in your packet tonight if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of the comments. But we have been busy since February, also engaging with neighboring businesses, Issaquah History Museum on this project as well, the Creative Arts District Board, Downtown Issaquah Association, Visit Issaquah, also senior center patrons at various different groups that gather there. So it's been really quite exciting to get their feedback on this project. So we did the online survey and we worked with the ad hoc committee to review some of those comments that came through. And also ad hoc helped guide us into what we're going to be reviewing tonight, which is design direction for a preferred concept. And with that, I will pass it over to Methuen team. I think Christian's going to take lead and start us off here.
Thanks, Jennifer. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so Jennifer said, my name's Christian Runge. I'm a landscape architect at Methuen and part of the team with Amelia Jensen here on the design team. And you've also met Deb Gunther a bunch of times as well over time, as well as in the last meeting where we presented those 2 options. So we're really excited to kind of give you an update on what we've been up to and thinking through the community feedback and sort of the next steps for the design in general. Just wanted to say thanks to the ad hoc committee for really being a great sounding board, to really giving us really nuanced and helpful and thoughtful feedback along the way. And of course, we saw a lot of your faces in general at the open house and along the way, providing great feedback. So we really appreciate that and take it to heart, and really really respect the opportunity that we have here to kind of work on it in a significant space like this in Issaquah. So we are really excited to share our thinking about it so far. So we can go to the next slide. We've so this is just a high-level summary of some of the feedback we heard from the community. I think most of you saw some of the online survey comments and poll results. We had almost 500 respondents, which is amazing. And some of the themes that we took away from that are first around the water feature. There's a really strong interest in the idea of a water feature that's more tactile, of the style of the Creekside table. That's something you can walk up to and touch. Children might want to interact with. It has a feel and mass to it, but it's also at the right scale, that it's not overdone, it's not too large, that it presents a kind of subtle use of water. There was a lot of excitement for some of the casual social opportunities that the Creekside table presented as well. That raised lawn space, some of the other flexible areas that provide spaces for small groups to gather, teens to gather, families to hang out in a more casual setting. There was a lot of excitement around both concepts, providing flexibility and openness, and that's really a desired feature in all these spaces. We've heard points here tonight, as well as from the ad hoc committee, about scale, about making sure that there's that openness and flexibility. We don't fill the space up with too many things and go back to sort of where we are now with that space. So we really take that to heart and are continuing to study that. We're looking for a stronger and more visible environmental approach, both to use of water, but also to plants, to landscape, to how we think about a downtown Issaquah type environment. A desire for authenticity, a relationship to Old Town, to the history, as well as the present and future of Issaquah as a town. That it's something that's engaging 365 days a year and at all times of the day, including the evenings. And that it presents itself, both the water feature, the plants, the lighting are kind of have a multi-season type function to them. And also with the shelter itself, like the water feature and Plaza designs, a lot of strong interest in both concepts, almost overwhelming support for either one or the other, but a little bit of a lean towards the Creekside table shelter, which is the more simple option. And we think, though you can interpret that in a lot of different ways, we think one of the reasons is that simple and more timeless design works well in a lot of contexts. The senior center is an 80s building, the depot is a historic building, the city hall is another architecture. And we want a park architecture that really can work with a lot of different styles. Say if this pavilion is replicated in other parts of Veterans Memorial Field in the future as it unfolds as a space, including Depot Plaza as well. So we can go to the next slide. So what we've decided to do is we've decided to take this Creekside table concept as a starting point for this next evolution of design. Think about the sort of the pros and cons of the Valley Trail and start to develop something from there. So what we're going to show you tonight is an evolution of the Creekside table. And wanted to start by just thinking a little bit about the meaning of what this concept is. It's the story of Creekside, which really to us means the idea of nature and the strong passion around environment and nature in the city of Issaquah, as well as the table, which is really to us about community and about town, that being in that town life, that downtown Issaquah life. So next slide. So we wanted to explore these two ideas further and situate them in something that we feel is hopefully more authentic to the town. And so from the perspective of nature, we're thinking about what does it mean to be in the valley? This is downtown Issaquah is in the valley. It's in more of a flat terrain. It's not the foothills. It's not Snoqualmie Pass, and it's not right on Puget Sound. So it's a very unique environment, and waterways like Issaquah Creek itself, the geology and nature and plants all have a special character in this valley setting. So we explored that. And then with community and history and the town, we thought about this idea of crossroads, both because this site is a railroad, a site where the railroad used to run off from the depot building, but also that Issaquah, from its history pre-settlement, pre-European settlement into indigenous history into now, has always had sort of a a sense of crossroads, something Don Fells, the artist, brought up in some of his assessment of art planning opportunities in the town, that this is really something that transcends all the histories of Issaquah, that this crossroads environment, it's both in the past, but also has a foot in contemporary life and future that makes the town so vibrant. So we really wanted to explore what that meant for this space as well. Next slide, please. So when we talk about nature in the valley, we thought about a couple things. The valley stream, streams like Issaquah, when they get into the flats, they meander. And that's exactly what you would see in a space like this. The geology is actually much more fine-grained and much more textured. We know we've presented options previously that may have had, say, large boulders or other elements with maybe of the mountains, but the valley is more about the gravels, the cobbles of the gravel bars of the creek, the more fine-grained textures that you would find in the valley floors of this region. And then with nature and planting, it's a little more lush, it's a little more fine textured, the meadows and riparian areas of the creek spaces that are in contrast to the high foothills around town. So that's something of what we were exploring with nature. And then next slide, this image is a sketch superimposed over a historic aerial of the town, just kind of highlighting then the crossroads nature of town, this intersection of roadways, of this historic passage over Snoqualmie Pass, this first landing spot when you come down from the pass, and then on your way over to the waterways of the Puget Sound, this really significant crossroads we want to continue to explore. So next slide. Just getting into a little bit more detail about the form that we're exploring. So the valley stream, the meander, the pools, the riffles, these are some of the inspiration points that we were starting to play off of. The gravel bars you would find in the flat meandering pathways of Issaquah Creek, which you see on the left-hand side in that LiDAR image through downtown. And then we started to think about how water would express itself in a similar way, the sort of meandering forms, the sort of undulations around textured cobble or sandbars that you start to see here on these water feature examples on the right-hand side. On the next slide, we also thought a little bit more again about the geology, the idea of these gravel bars, the cobble elements, and how this finer grained texture could take shape in a water feature. You can see examples of how it can just be a very simple, beautiful reflecting pool where you see that reflection of the cobble of the valley, or in slightly raised surfaces that can provide a little texture to a flowing water runnel across flat grades. You kind of see these expressions of cobble in water features as well. And then next slide, we also are exploring plants and what it means to be in a plant in a sort of natural environment in the valley. And we were thinking a lot about these ideas of sort of boardwalks and walking paths and footbridges that may traverse lowland environments around the valley, and really thinking about how that might inspire planting design in this valley to create something that feels really natural, but also fits within an urban context, and also provide sort of open sight lines. And then with the community and crossroads, we're looking at both a lot of the historic fabric of town, downtown. We've heard comments about the fish ladders, that sort of infrastructure part of the city. We know all about the railroad and the sort of passages and the trestles that ran through the valley as well. And we started to think about how that might inform materials, furnishings, different elements that might express some of that history in a way that feels situated and is also usable in the present as seating, as places for social gathering. And really as a way that we can use these elements in a way that can promote community, can promote socialization. You get this with benches that provide opportunities for people to sit and talk to each other versus sit alone and look at their phone, or families to hang out and kind of group in different ways. So that kind of flexibility was something we also wanted to explore. Next slide. So just as an overall idea, what we were trying to do with this updated design direction is really start to play off these ideas of the valley nature and the town and blend them together through this water feature element and the gravel bar, which is, again, this raised lawn element that you saw in the previous concept. So I'll just go to the next slide because there's a lot more on that one. So what you're seeing here is that we have went kind of all in on this idea of more meandering curvilinear type water feature, as well as landscape plantings. And I think what this really means to us is that this pedestrian park is becoming a park. It's bringing the Park of Veterans Memorial Field, it's bringing it out to downtown Issaquah. It's bringing it right out to the front door of the park, and it's creating almost like a park-like environment within the plaza. So it has those plaza functions, but it's also the gateway to the park. So what we're thinking here is that the middle island essentially is that raised lawn. It provides that opportunity for sociable picnicking and seating for small groups. It still has an edge that's a water feature, but it's a much more meandering water feature. And you can see one idea we have here is that the water feature itself is a meandering form, but also maybe the paving pattern that you see here in gray is also a meandering form. It might be a hexagonal paver or something that creates more of a fractal or natural kind of pixelated look to the paving that feels a little more natural and less rigid. And the edges on both sides would have planters, potentially rain garden planters to train stormwater that's flowing off the hardscape areas, and also provide opportunities on the left side for more intimate and kind of immersive experience through a narrower pathway through more of a natural environment. And on the right side, a more open pathway. That's about a 10 to 15 foot wide walkway that has direct sight lines to the depot, but also opportunities to meander within that to create. We heard a lot of feedback about avoiding sort of these straight axial views that might feel a little stale. So to create that experience of wandering and slowing down as you go through the pedestrian plaza, giving a chance to linger, also knowing that your head might be heading to the depot or beyond. So on the next slide, you'll see a couple different sections to give you a sense of what this looks like three-dimensionally. The plaza, the lawn itself is fairly low. And one big difference from the previous schemes to this one is that you'll see on the lower elevation that the lawn is sloped from the street side at Sunset to the back towards Depot. It's sloped from about a 2 foot high wall down to zero, down to flush with grade. And what that does is it provides wheelchair accessibility onto this lawn. And it's approximately about a 2 to 3% slope, which as a sitting surface is pretty much flat. But as a element that's viewed, you'll see that it's sloped. So we really wanted to look at how this space could be more accessible and inclusive to everybody. So this idea of the tip lawn came into play in that way, but it also happens to, we think, kind of express a more of a natural kind of form that feels like the gravel bar that we're trying to evoke. And so that's what you see here with this idea that there's sort of a more of a raised element on the street side that presents the water feature, and then it gradually slopes down to the maples and the natural side towards the back and provides that open opportunity along the way. And you can get a sense from the section, the upper section, this idea of a narrower path on the left side and a wider path on the right side that allows more free-flowing circulation for pedestrians. Lastly, you can see these benches here. Again, this idea of, in this case, we're interested in this idea of a bench that evokes the railroad in the sort of railroad ties, and even the metal base might have the sort of rail kind of metal character to it. So that's another opportunity just to insert something that feels a little more historic. And if you go to the next slide, please. Get a little bit of a sense three-dimensionally. We didn't really present like a fully finished perfect rendering here. This is more just to give you a sense of the scale. But again, this opportunity for the meandering water feature and paving pattern. One thing that's not shown here, we'll show you in the materials next. We're exploring both the idea of these hexagonal pavers or more natural kind of paver element that might intersect with more of a rail-inspired paving that might have a more of a linear rhythm to it that feels a little bit more like that rail line rhythm. So we kind of have this juxtaposition of more of the town and the history and the nature within the paving itself. So we recognize we want something to feel natural, but we also want it to have the energy of town, that it's a space that has an atmosphere to it that feels a little bit sort of contemporary, situated within the town itself. So you can see the view to the depot, the promenade through, the water feature on one edge, scaled down and kind of with spillover. And I'll show you describe a little bit of that in a second. The raised lawn and what we're calling the Valley Trail on the left side. So next slide. So just a couple notes about the water feature, like Charlie's caveats, it's not designed yet, but what we're thinking is that it's going to have essentially 3 components. The first is that there will be a runnel that runs along the top along with the lawn. And that's what you see with number 1 on the upper left. It's sort of a channel that's up at the level with the lawn. And that's the place where we could have the sort of idea of little fountains that when uplit, create kind of a candle effect at night. as well as this opportunity when the water is going up and down to provide those channels and undulations that create a natural effect, as well as the reflecting effect. So we can really play with the subtle variations of water to express that meandering Issaquah Creek, as well as the atmosphere of the town through the candles. And then at strategic moments, particularly at the entrance to the park, or the pedestrian park by the street, there might be a space where it spills over, as we're calling the riffle falls, where it's sort of spilling over textured cobbly type elements that create a sort of a softer sound, really evoke that sound and the quieter sound of the creek in the valley, and provide that tactile element that children can walk up to, that you can kind of feel that natural feel to it. So that's what those images are evoking. And then when it hits the bottom, it would sort of spill out into a shallow pool that would be fairly narrow. It might be 5 feet wide, but it would be a shallow kind of pool that you see down here that's just basically a thin scrim of water that basically gives you a space to provide more reflections for children to kind of run past and stomp, and kind of another tactile experience. So that's what you see down on here on the right side. So what we're setting up here is this opportunity to use these 3 different water feature ideas to play with the scale, to really to provide some different moments along the way that are both create some atmosphere, as well as stay within something that's a little more subtle and of the town and of the creek. So the next slide. Just to give you an example, some of the thoughts we have around materials, you can see on the left some of the ways we think you could express the Issaquah Creek cobble idea with materials. Gentle cascades, subtle runnels, reflection, natural materials like cobble. The planting can kind of take a more naturalistic form in terms of meadow or riparian planting. Even the small trees themselves might evoke birches or alders or other types of trees you might see in riparian environments. The paving can take on a more naturalistic, almost pixelated look like some of these images, or held a little bit more in contrast with more linear paving that might sort of replicate and reference the rail line. And then you see the plinth here, give you a sense of the scale of what that is. It's fairly low. This raised table is a low element. Provides opportunity for seating on the edge as well as on top. And then this idea of using materials like wood to really warm up the space, reference some of the rail materials in history. Next slide, please. This, moving over to the senior center for a second, just want to show you what we really wanted to look at here to start is we wanted to see how this idea of the valley, the meandering valley concept translates over to the senior center. And we think it can really translate over quite nicely and provide this more park-like connection between pedestrian park, depot, and the senior center into the main park itself. And so this is not a final design, but it kind of captures some of the key elements that we think will move forward in this design, including a flexible seating and shelter area, as we've kind of been showing it before. A sort of central spine or promenade that sort of has more of a meandering feel to it, with opportunities for seating next to planters. These seats here you can see in section, maybe a little bit like the lawn you saw at Pedestrian Park, but instead of maybe a lawn, could be a tipped or a sloped planter with seating on one side and planting on the other that faces the parking lot and provides some screening, and maybe some side pathways that allow for more quiet, more intimate seating for all of the community and seniors as well. And then as you move towards the center, we heard that comment at the very beginning about the memorial, and it's really a point well taken. What we're anticipating doing is yes, we do want to use that memorial as a focal point to situate it in a way that really highlights it as something that's present in the site, and really can't take that lightly at all. Like, it's a really important design exercise to think about the siting, the situating memorial element. And we really appreciate some of the comments about the history. We'd love to talk more about that kind of stuff, the missing voices, the other elements that could be added to this. So we see that as part of this design. It's an important part of how that edge along the parking is addressed and how we locate that element. So it's really an important piece to us to maintain it in this space and enhance it. And then lastly, as you move towards the park and up to the north and east side of the senior center, we're planning that as a sort of a bocce and activity area. And that's an opportunity for a number of different activities. If you go to the next slide, you can see some of the activities we heard a lot of excitement about in the community engagement around the idea of activities like bocce. This is a bocce court that we've designed in an urban environment that has actually stormwater function below it, but it situates very nicely into a simple plaza environment. We've heard a lot of interest in opportunities for multi-generational play in the form of fixed chess tables, a desire for flexible space for dancing, social gatherings, other activities. So that's really important. The opportunities for social seating for people of all generations and like generations and different generations to interact with each other, and for places to sit and kind of watch the park life unfold, and also the interest in gardening and more interactive planting, like raised garden beds and horticultural opportunities for the folks that use the senior center. One of the last slides. The next slide is just a reminder of the Creekside Table Shelter. And again, as I mentioned before, there was a lot of interest in both schemes in the idea of something that's warm, that uses wood to evoke the natural character of Issaquah, that uses a more simple form that could be translate well next to an 80s building, next to a historic depot building, that has a mixture of transparency on the roof, as in this form, one example is skylights, but also provide shelter from the rain. And that flexibility underneath the space and size and scale that allows a lot of different uses, similar to as we were discussing with the Eck House. And lastly, but definitely not least, we've begun to explore what we think are some really interesting possibilities for sustainable approaches to this design. We're working in more of a downtown environment in Issaquah, and by that I mean the town. It's not an urban environment, but we're using more hardscape, for instance, where we're using different approaches. And some of the opportunities we think are around the use of rain gardens, biofiltration on the site to really both express the idea of riparian planting and creekside planting, as well as treat water. We think soil cells are an interesting opportunity. I'm not sure if how familiar with everyone is with these, but it's essentially an underground structure that allows us to have continuous soil systems and continuous root systems between trees. So if we do plant a grove of trees that goes straight through hardscape Plaza, the underground system is totally connected. And really a lot of data shows results in much happier and healthier trees, which both of these translate to the idea of enhanced habitat for both at the smaller scale with the enhanced plantings, as well as with the trees themselves. Deploying salmon safe practices for very obvious reasons, and that could be with the choice of materials, thinking about runoff, etc. And then thinking about the opportunities for reclaim, recycled, and sustainable materials, both as a way to evoke the history of the site and that rich history, but also be careful and cautious with our resources. So these are just some of the ideas that we're starting to explore that we think are opportunities that could really have a visible presence and strong impact, meaningful and real impact in the life of the plaza. I think that's the last slide. I'm sorry that was so long, but we're excited to kind of share all these ideas. We're really looking forward to hearing your feedback and answer any questions if you have them. And as Jen's already mentioned, again, we're presenting this as a sort of a direction we're headed, with the idea that we're going to continue, if there's interest in this, we're going to continue over the next month or so, finalizing more of a preferred design that will be sent out to the community for a look, as well as then start to work towards our construction drawings and permit drawings and whatnot. So this is as a step in that process. So I appreciate your time, and looking forward to hearing any feedback or comments you have.
Great. Thank you, Christian. I think right now I'd like to turn it over to ad hoc to see if you have any feedback for the board at large as far as some of the conversation we've had at our meetings, as far as the design direction and where you'd like to go with this.
Want to go first?
Okay. Yeah, so there were a lot of comments around, in the survey around wanting the park to be more natural looking, to make sure that we're designing this park that doesn't look like it's in New York. Or there were comments about practicality of maintenance. So I think what they designed based on the feedback reflects a strong consideration of the comments which were a lot, and emphasis on community identity, which is around the creekside element of Issaquah. So that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, I can add as well. It was really impressive to see how Bethune just started way down at the very basic, words that were identified in the in all the feedback, and then how they just worked their way up from that to sort of some simple shapes and simple ideas to what they presented now, and at the same time folding in the more specific desires that people expressed. And then I think it's really important to note that this is still, a concept design, although it's moved, quite far along. And, some of the comments about managing the scale and the width, we've talked about that before. And I guess I wanted to say, I feel comfortable that they are really looking at that. And having seen some of the work they've done and some of the rendering, and then also just some of the comments that we provided during our most recent ad hoc meeting. And so I think what you see here is pretty far along, but still will be, worked and massaged quite a bit more to really fit some of the real refined details that people are commenting on right now.
Marlene and the other Andrew learned this survey. So, okay. Well, thank you, ad hoc. I'd like to open it up to Park Board. See if you have any more feedback. As Christian mentioned, we would, if the board so supported, would like perhaps an eventual motion, if possible, that we might be able to continue furthering in this design, as Christian mentioned, in order to lead us into future construction documents. This would come back for additional feedback as we started refining some of the elements, but there we go. I see Brad, you have a hand up?
Yeah, great stuff, Christian. Looks really good. 2 comments, 1 question, all very short. Really like the water features. Figuring in water in motion and the sound of water is 2 key important elements, in my opinion, to make an effective water feature. And so, and it looks like you are considering that. As much as I like wood, love wood, very hard to maintain. So, I have a little concern, I guess, with tables and benches and all that kind of stuff in terms of what kind of material would be used long term. So that's certainly a consideration. My last is just a question. Is the playground next to the senior center going to be removed, or is that going to be staying where it is?
The playground is staying where it is at this time. We are hoping, if budget would allow, to add an additional accessible route to the playground. However, we are not touching the playground as part of this work. Okay.
That's it for me. Thanks. Looks good.
Thanks, Matt. Danielle?
I was surprised in kind of the setup of the description of this project that we talked about the creek, which I get, and the depot, but we didn't mention the historic nature of the field. And I just want to, make sure that we're all on the same page. Like this field was brought to us by our community like 100 years ago. It was a grassroots firefighters and miners basically bought the property in order to play baseball on it. And so I think it's important that we remember that, and as we think about renovating these parks, that we think about the history of them and what elements we want to keep. That field was also used for baseball by them. It was used for the high school for football and baseball, and like the remnants of the grandstands are there. And it is, and for rodeos too. So there are a lot of other elements I think that we could, think about incorporating into a plan. And I just wonder, we're not talking right now about the master plan for that or planning for that part of the park, But I want to make sure that whatever we do here will, you know, be neutral enough to be able to work with whatever happens, you know, with that field.
Agreed.
And just because this is my last park board meeting on this board, I just want to say, like, in my mind, it would be a beautiful nod to history to create a really nice little league field in that baseball area. And would allow, wouldn't have the same encroachments because they don't hit as far into the other areas of the park. But it is the most spectacular place in Issaquah to watch a baseball game. And Little League, you know, you just have so many little kids and it's such a family, fun atmosphere. And I think the senior center, it might draw, you know, people to come watch the games there and stuff too. So I hope that, and that would be a beautiful nod to our history, in Issaquah. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there and make sure that whatever it is that we're doing and that we're designing it, that, you know, also will work with whatever the future plans are there.
You may recall as part of the master planning work, we had worked with John Fells, who created kind of a guiding document about some of the history in these spaces. And that has really been guiding some of our design for this, keeping in mind kind of the bigger picture as to what we're doing. So we're really thinking for this space, but how it could also translate to a bigger story as part of the whole
Right.
park. So
I think that's.
we've had a lot of conversation in and around that.
Good, thanks.
Any other comments or feedback? Well, if no other comments, I'd like to propose a motion to support the preferred design for pedestrian park and senior center plaza and move the project's design forward into construction documents and permitting.
I'll second that.
Great. So I think we have time for a little bit of discussion there. And I just want to make note that we do have a lot of regular members that are not in attendance for this meeting. So I will need both alternate members to vote for this meeting.
Okay, so all in favor of approving the motion, raise your hand.
Okay, I have 5. And David, did you want to abstain or vote no? Oh, I see.
Voting to move forward, yeah.
Great. Okay. All 6?
Great. And we look forward to bringing this forward. And as we further the design and keeping you abreast of where we're at in the process. So thank you for that. As a quick reminder, kind of where we're at, as we further refine the design, like I said, we would share it. We'll start working into construction documents and permitting and hopefully by the end of this year. I say that with all fingers and toes crossed. We will be starting construction and moving this project forward to try and meet our deadline for next year. So with that, thank you all very much for your time. Sorry, we've run just a little bit over, but I will turn it back to you, Chair.
Okay, great. I'll keep mine pretty brief here, but I mainly wanted to take this opportunity to recognize Danielle for her 18 years of service on the board and also her 5 years of service as the chair. And just thank you so much for your.
Yeah, I'm sure that you want to see me around, I'm sure. It's all good, those chairs. And on that, there you go. Thank you. It's been great. It's amazing how everything seems to go so slowly, but you know, like it does, you know, it's amazing what actually gets done in that time.
Yeah.
So,
Well, thank you for your service.
pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And then my only other thing, next week is we'll be nominating potential for chair, vice chair, and perhaps going through elections for that. So if you have interest in volunteering for chair or vice chair, just take the next week or so, or not, next month or so to sort of decide on that and turn it over to the youth representative.
Yeah, so, we just had our Harry Potter night event a couple of weeks ago, and that was really good. We also had our State of Mind conference, and that was also a big success. And then, coming up, June 4th, I believe, we have our Issaquah Kids Triathlon, and that's our biggest and final event of the year.
Wow,
Great.
coming up quick.
And director's report.
Yes, I will be filling in for
Jen will
Jeff
be filling in.
for,
Maybe we'll do it.
I can do it really quick,
Quickly?
so
Okay.
bear with me. Just a couple of items, because I know we have some ad hoc members that are wondering, when am I gonna start? When am I gonna start? So quick update on those items. Hillside Park, really quick, we are in design and permitting right now. We are at 60% construction documents. We're doing a quick review. We hope to submit our permit package by the first week of May. So with that, once it gets submitted, we'll be in the active process, and then we'll also have an environmental meeting as part of that process and go on. But thank you, Mithun, for your hard work in getting us in on permitting on that. The dog park over by the community center, we finalized our scope with HPB Landscape Architecture. And we are anticipating probably the second week of May doing some public engagement around that, looking at some options for layout as well as materials. So more to come on that really soon. The park strategic plan ad hoc, we're gonna need just a few more weeks before you get rolling here. We're still finalizing the scope with the consultant. Design workshop, and we hopefully their first steps will be kind of collecting data and doing some reconnaissance and wrapping their head around everything. But once they get rolling, we will definitely get you engaged ad hoc. So probably another 3-4 weeks, I would assume you may have your first meeting or so. So just keep an eye out for an email regarding that. And then real quick, urban forestry management plan ad hoc. I know Dan has been drafting his RFQ. Been coordinating with him on that, and I would anticipate that being advertised soon. It'll probably have a 3-week advertising period, consultant selection, and then we'll get you rolling. So it might be 6 to 8 weeks before that's actually final. But anyways, more to come soon on that once we get a consultant on board. That's it.
All right.
Great. I want, just adding on to what Zach said, another huge thank you to Danielle. For our next May meeting, we will have one new alternate member that will be joining us. So we'll have some new faces, a new face. And then if anybody is interested in nominating themselves or nominating somebody else for chair or vice chair, we will add that to the agenda for the next meeting, and you all will vote to have that for your next park board to have your chair and vice chair. And if anybody's interested in what that leadership opportunity entails, feel free to send an email over to myself or Jeff, and we're happy to chat ahead of that meeting. And that's it.
Great. Okay, so call to close the meeting for today. Next meeting's May 22nd.
Great.
See you all then.
Have a great night. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Hi, thank you.